This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome back to Ex-Evangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. Today I'm very fortunate to share a conversation with Dr. Keisha McKenzie, a consultant and blogger at McKenzian.com, whom you can also find on Twitter at McKenzian. She shares her story of growing up in the UK, attending school in Jamaica, as well as her time living in the US, all while engaging her Adventist faith and finding communities that helped her continue to ask the questions that she wanted to ask. It's a great conversation that covers a lot of ground across politics, religion, and sexuality, or what she refers to as the 3 taboos on her website. There are 3 ways to support the show. First, you can support the show through Patreon at patreon.com/exvangelical. Second, if you want any of the books we mention, please go ahead and follow the links in the show notes. Those are affiliate links, and we'll get a portion of the proceeds of anything you purchase through those. And finally, you can rate and review the show on iTunes. All ratings and reviews there on iTunes help boost the visibility of the show considerably. You can also follow me on Twitter at brchastain. You can follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at exvangelicalpod. And you can like us on facebook.com/exvangelicalpod. Alright, let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to Ex-Evangelical. I have with me this week Dr. Keisha McKenzie. She is a consultant, a prolific blogger at McKenzian.com, and you can also find her on Twitter at the same name, at McKenzian. Welcome to the show, Keisha.
Thanks, Blake.
Thank you for joining me. Let's talk a little bit about where you grew up and your background. Where are you from originally?
I was born in London, England, to Jamaican parents, both of whom moved from Jamaica to the UK in around 1964-65. They were part of the second generation of Caribbean immigrants most of whom were born in the islands as British subjects. Because it's a monarchy, you're not really a citizen, you're a subject. And they moved from the islands to the mother country just to start a new professional life. My parents happened to meet in the UK in the church circuit and married and raised 3 kids, and I am the bonus, the last one.
I'm not really quite clear on this. So when you move from somewhere where you're a subject to the mother country, to England, does your status change? Do you become a citizen, or you still maintain that subject status? What was that like for your...
So it was all pretty awkward for those first few generations, because the empire being what it was at that time, declining, but still with political authority over the colonies, what they would call the colonies. So you had a situation where people were raised within the culture of the British Empire, trained in the Queen's English, trained to revere English institutions, including the Anglican Church. And then they go to the mother country and they are not respected. Racism was pretty severe at that point, and still is, but in a much more subtle fashion. And so a lot of my elders, especially the generation above me, they became really disillusioned once they touched ground in England, because they had, many of them, either contributed to British schools, or even some of them had served in the British military. And so with a similar situation to U.S. veterans, U.S. Black veterans, where they had served abroad for the country, but then returned home and not found welcome. That was pretty much the situation. So my parents' generation faced real struggles with finding apartments, earning much less than they were worthy of, in whether they were training as nurses or teachers or in the trades, all sorts of job discrimination, street discrimination, and yet they were just trying to build a better life for themselves and, in some cases, for their families back home.
And how did that play out within your domestic life?
So by the time I came along, my parents were pretty much settled in. About 20 something years later, um, I arrived on the scene. We lived in a small area in southeast London, about half an hour from the church that I grew up in attending. My dad, by that point, was a social worker. My mother, by that point, was an encyclopedia salesperson, as it turns out. So she'd gone through nursing training, still did some shifts on the side, but she really thrived in the sales environment. And my dad brought home this steady income through social work.
And what was that? What was that church that you went to? What, did it have a denominational affiliation?
Oh yeah. My family is Seventh Day Adventist, and my mother's family, her parents converted in the 1930s in Jamaica. Uh, Grandma's original background was Anglican. Grandfather didn't have a denominational affiliation. But in the early 1900s, the Seventh day Adventist Church sent missionaries over to Jamaica and really found a great reception among lower farming class, working class people there. So within 2 generations, it's become one of the fastest growing denominations in the island, and uh, completely different situation than it is in the US, where a lot of people still don't know about the Adventist Church, except for the fact that we worship on Saturdays. A lot of members are vegetarian, um, and there tends to be a lot of confusion between the Adventist Church and the LDS Church. But
Mm-hmm.
my grandparents were the converts in my family, and most of our family remains within the church community.
Does aside from those more externally visible things like worshiping on Saturdays and the vegetarianism, what are some other like theological hallmarks of the Seventh Day Adventist Church that may be similar or differ from other Protestant denominations?
Right. So I'd classify the community as majority evangelical and minority, but vocal minority fundamentalist. So that's where I'd situate it within the Protestant matrix. Um, the founders of the church included people who, during the Second Great Awakening in the mid 1830s, 1840s, either left congregations like Baptist, Seventh day Baptist, Methodist, Christian Connection. So there was a real theological mix among the original, that first generation of Seventh day Adventists.
Hmm.
The dominant belief, hence the name Adventist, is a belief in the imminent second coming of Jesus. So it's very much focused on the end of times, and um, in the ideal, it's designed to help people figure out um, how to draw hope from that scenario versus, I mean, the shadow side of it is that you get a lot of focus on prophecies and beasts and, who's bringing in the Antichrist these days, and should we be hyper vigilant about the Pope and the papacy and U.S. surveillance culture. There's definitely a shadow side to that theological framework, but when it's at least a little bit healthy, it can lead people to really have a sense of urgency around making sure that each moment counts, that you live out the best of your religious values as best as you can, and that you share what's good about your tradition with the people around you. That's the ideal.
Yeah, and that I do think that sort of shadow side does kind of tend to um, find
Predominate.
yeah,
Oh yeah.
and find prominence in the more general evangelical sort of milieu, cultural milieu, I guess. It seems like the late great planet Earth and all the different things about trying to find out when things will end. I worked at a Christian bookstore when it was the year 2000, so it was like
Oh my
it
goodness.
was it was in the air, and it was always that predominant concern.
So it's funny about that. I was in Jamaica during Y2K panic, and I didn't feel it, and the Adventist culture that I was in didn't really care about it. And one of the reasons why is that maybe learning from early mistakes where church members got really into setting dates for the second coming. And in fact, the Great Disappointment, which is celebrated October 22, is, or not celebrated is the wrong word, but memorialized each year, October 22, as the date when the Millerites, people who were really taken by the evangelical message of William Miller, who was a millenarian, he had figured out, based on his literalist reading of some verses in Daniel and parsing of Jewish calendars, that Jesus would be coming back to Earth on October 22, first 1843 and then 1844. And of course, there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth as nothing happened on either date. And there were a subset of his followers who tried to say that something did happen, but it wasn't what they expected. Others who said, the whole thing, let's call the whole thing off and go back to our original churches. But out of the group that said something happened and we should acknowledge that he was right about the calculation but wrong about the meaning, came the Seventh-day Adventist denomination. So this is a group that has gone through several cycles of really intense prediction around date setting and has learned not to do that. But of course, that never stops people who say, oh, we don't know the day exactly, but we know it's happening because of these signs. And there's always that tendency within the subculture to say, whether it is increased visibility of earthquakes or the latest war or LGBT people being visible, there's always some sign that can be used as a token that tells them this is the end. So there is that too.
That's very interesting, that desire to just attach some sort of temporal thing to that, to the idea of the second coming.
Well, yeah, and I think evangelicals, even like Pat Robertson, do pretty much the same thing. If there's a tornado, then queer people caused it, or if there's a calamity of any sort, it's because America isn't doing what they think it should be doing. And so there is always that tendency within this branch of Christianity to assign meanings that match their doctrines to things that are happening around. And the unfortunate thing is that it tends not to encourage responsibility for changing those things. It tends more to accommodate a kind of passive response or a controlling response to the things.
Mm-hmm. Changing gears a little bit, going back to being in London, what was your experience of evangelicalism in the UK? What was the overall evangelical culture like there, and did it differ at all from what you've experienced? And because you've lived in the United States since 2004, according to your site,
yeah.
correct? So is there anything that kind of sets apart this sort of evangelical experience in the UK, either for good or for bad? And also, are there any sort of commonalities there?
So, I mean, I left the UK when I was 15, but I'm still pretty much in touch with my friends there. And so my exposure to evangelicalism was really shaped by the congregation, the local church that I was raised in. I was baptized in when I was 12/13 years old, and participated there really actively until I left for college. And at that time, my congregation was almost exclusively Black, whether first or second generation immigrant or West African first or second generation immigrant. And so for many, many years, my experience of conservative religion was shaped by the fact that all of the people in it looked like me and my parents and my aunts and uncles, or people that we called aunts and uncles, because that's just how our culture works. By contrast, the Church of England and Roman Catholicism in the UK was dominated by white indigenous English people, and also very much shaped by the stereotypically reserved English culture around not too much expression, not too much spontaneity, fairly rigid worship style, yet they were much more open about discussing doctrinal issues. Whereas my congregation was not charismatic by any means, but had a really rich musical tradition, which I appreciate to this day, and really encourage people to fully engage with their whole attention, really strong on visual, um, connecting visually with the congregation who's participating by listening or speaking, and connecting that with the speaker or connecting with the choir. Just really a really full body experience. So in that sense, in terms of worship style versus theological styles, those are some of the differences between the two cultures that I was in, both the immediate Caribbean English culture and the wider white English culture.
And where did you go to college?
I went to an Adventist college in Mandeville, Manchester, Jamaica. So if you can imagine Jamaica being an oval on its long side, Manchester is a parish in the south central quadrant of the island, and it's country. It's about 2.5 hours away from Kingston, or two if you drive a little fast, and 3 hours away from Montego Bay, which is where most of the tourists live. So inland, up in the mountains, moderate climate, tends to be where the returning residents go. So people who left the island maybe in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s come back to the island when they've retired and spent most of their working years abroad, but they are coming back to that area mostly because the climate is much more tolerable for them. And so it's an interesting, almost a microcosm of the Jamaican diaspora. So people who have had experience living abroad, so have a broader sense of life and experience than those who, for whatever reason, weren't able to leave. But people who've had families abroad, their kids largely are also abroad. And so a lot of older people tend to be in that area. I lived with my grandparents for 6 years. And it was great. I didn't really know them before I moved there, but it was nice to be the millennial in the silent generation's house. I learned a lot.
That's great.
I learned
Yeah.
a lot about my family and about old Jamaica. That's Jamaica that hasn't been influenced by U.S. culture through cable,
Oh, okay.
cable TV. And I learned about our family traditions, and it helped me to understand, I think, some of the things that made um, our family our family's relationship to the Adventist Church so strong. Like for my grandfather in particular, converting to the church when he was in his 20s gave him an opportunity to kind of escape the subsistence farmer life. And so he was able to, through the church, kind of educate himself. He learned to read prolifically. He still reads every day. He's 102 years old right now, and he still reads. He doesn't speak anymore. He doesn't preach anymore. But this is a guy who basically read himself into what would have been at least a college degree.
Wow.
And to talk to him, you wouldn't know that he didn't finish high school. And that's part of the traditional Seventh-day Adventist culture, that you really study the scriptures, you study the writings of Ellen White and other church leaders, and you engage the text in a way that helps you to learn how to formulate arguments about it, primarily to justify the church's teachings on things. But there is at least that initial encouragement to engage texts and to study, as they say, to show yourself approved.
And you mentioned that joining the church was your grandfather's way to escape subsistence farming. Does the Adventist Church provide educational tools?
Yeah.
Is that a big part of their tradition as well?
It is. And as a matter of fact, internationally, it is the largest education system other than the Roman Catholic education system. So there are a number of academies, like elementary schools to middle school, several colleges around the United States, and more cropping up around the world. And so the one that I went to, the college that I went to, is one of those. It's been open since I think 1919 is their formal start date. So at least almost 100 years. Some of these schools have been in service, and they started, many of them, to train pastors, to train teachers, and to train nurses.
Wow, yeah.
And then from there, through the late 20th century, then they branch out to the various other disciplines.
Yeah, I also went to a Christian college, and it actually has a similar founding date. I think it's 1920.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that just historically that there tended to be a lot of Christian colleges being founded around that time,
Mm-hmm.
both in reaction to some of the influence of modernism as well as
Absolutely.
some other things. But as far as what the school was like, did it have similarities to some of the more conservative Christian colleges here? Did they have a lot of restrictions in regards to these sorts of things that they allowed the student body to do? As some examples, like our school restricted the students from watching rated R movies, curfew for freshmen and sophomores, a strict dormitory visiting policy for opposite genders, that sort of thing. Did the Adventist school have any of those sorts of cultural trappings as well?
Oh yeah, yeah, it did, and I guess I escaped many of them because I did live with my grandparents, so I was off campus, so I never had the dorm experience, which I don't regret in the slightest. But at the same time, I was involved in student government and stuff like that, so I'm fairly familiar with a lot of the restrictions. And yeah, so for the first at least year and a half to 2 years, women were not allowed to wear pants on campus. It was a skirts only zone, unless you were actively engaged in sport. And then it was until you finish the sport, and then you wear your shorts, and then you're done. Back into appropriate garb for your gender. And that only changed when we became a university. So when I first went over, it was a college. And then it became chartered as a university in 1999. But yeah, similar strictures on dorm life, on the on sexual relationships between students. Like traditionally, if you were married, then you didn't stay on campus at all. That you had an apartment else off campus. I'm not sure if they thought that being married was contagious, but this is the kind of environment that we're talking about, where through policies, people are trying to control behavior. And not that it worked in the slightest, but it did create an environment where you knew that there was a lot of things you couldn't do, and it was framed in such a way that it became a matter of pride not to do them because we were cut of different cloth, and people were looking at the city set on a hill. And so there was a lot of concern around the appearance of righteousness. I think less concern about whether people internalized the ethics. And I think that's probably one of the easiest pitfalls for a traditional community to fall into, where compliance is enough. As long as people appear to be fit in the box, then you don't need to really engage them beyond that because they appear to be in compliance with your rules. But I think the higher value for religion is that and any kind of philosophical system really, is that it transforms the way that you're thinking about and situating yourself in relation to the world, so that you're not just in external compliance with something, but you figured out what the rationale is, and if the rationale is logical, then and benefits you or the people around you, then you can internalize the rule and express it in appropriate ways, no matter whether your environment allows you to do something or not.
Absolutely, yeah. How did you kind of take those rules when you were an adolescent, when you were young and attending this school? Did you find yourself in conflict with them at all? Since you lived off campus, you may not have had to obey a number of the on-campus sort of rules outside of the dress, which I haven't heard something like that. And I know that's very conservative,
Yes.
to say the least.
Yeah, and I mean, and even today in some Jamaican churches, you're not allowed to wear sleeveless, at least women are not allowed to wear sleeveless dresses. They expect you to wear a cardigan. People get very bent out of shape if you don't, because for some reason a woman's bicep is a immodest thing to see. And this is just like total legacy of
Yeah,
colonial propriety,
that
and people are not really thinking through the rule or what impact it has on people who just show up to worship or whatever. And so I think while I was in Jamaica, I was very much learning about the environment and kind of a curious personality. So I was just willing to throw myself into it as an adventure. It was my choice to go. I wasn't sent or anything. I chose to go. I visited on vacation and went back home and told my parents, I want to do this thing. And so I did. And so on the basis of really just inhabiting that adventure, I went in all the way. And at the same time, I grew up like a tomboy. And so this dresses all the time thing was pretty intense for me. Um, but I still did it. I still complied with a lot of those rules, but I was beginning to figure out that I could question some things. And I did ask difficult questions about why we had certain customs around baptism, or was there any logic to our customs about not wearing jewelry, which was at that time a really big thing. It's less so now, but it was a big thing then. Um, just these external markers for being part of what they call the remnant people. And did it have any biblical basis? Were the arguments we were using for it valid? What impact did it have on real people? Those sorts of things. I was beginning to do that, but I hadn't changed anything about the way I actually lived. I was just beginning to think through, what's the basis for these ideas and does it make any sense? And I think that's what a lot of college kids are doing when they go to school. It's not so much that they're trying to look for reasons not to do things. At least that wasn't my experience or observation of people. Um, it's just they want a safe place to question. And if we can't offer them that, then it's not really school. It's more an indoctrination center.
I totally agree with that as far as being more of an indoctrination. In retrospect, a number of students that I knew that were going through very intense questioning and criticism of their own beliefs, which I believe is what college is about. They very much felt conflicted about how they felt or how they thought they might believe in a given moment. And when you're in this environment where you have very clear rules about what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do, that can become it can create a lot of cognitive dissonance as you're trying to navigate finding your own beliefs, finding the foundation of your own beliefs, and yet feeling like it's not a safe space to do that. And I know it's making news about safe spaces and triggers and everything. I think University of Chicago stepped in something about that recently within academia, but just in the general use of that term, it being a place where you can freely examine your own thoughts without fear of retribution or being reprimanded.
Right.
That's a absolutely essential thing, and it does just default to a more of an indoctrination, and saw that play out at my school pretty clearly within some specific departments, the political science department and the religion department in particular. That being said, did you, and throughout your academic career, did you experience or take a break? Did you experience something where you stopped engaging with the Adventist tradition, or have you always kept this dialogue open as you continue to learn through college and through your postgraduate work as well?
So the space in my life where I think I did the most learning and growing was graduate school. When I moved again from Jamaica to West Texas, wasn't living with anybody this time. Was a little bit older in my early 20s and was doing a master's and then a PhD. The local churches that I was involved with at the time were, there were two Adventist churches in town, just two. So again, to go from Adventism in the UK, where it's not common, but it's everybody looks like me, and the churches are very vibrant and active. Then to move to Jamaica, where the church is much more socially dominant and politically dominant there. And then to come to West Texas, where there are only two churches in a town of like 200,000 people, was a culture shock, to say the least. And yet I participated at both churches for about 5 years of my 8 years stint in town. I think what happened was a combination of burnout from being so engaged in congregational life and service, as well as simply reading the scriptures through again. I'd grown up reading it in the context of Sabbath school classes and reading it in the context of being a teacher, or once or twice I shared sermons in my local church, but just really taking the personal time to re-engage the scriptures on their own terms, as far as I understood that at that time, to study and to really make good use of the internet, which I didn't have growing up and wasn't really quite accessible while I was in Jamaica. But the beautiful thing about access to information these days is that you don't need to go through an authority figure to get it. And if you've learned how to evaluate information and to evaluate sources, which God bless the humanities for teaching that sort of thing,
Yeah.
it enables you to do that kind of exploratory research and to seek answers to your own questions without depending on a single authority figure who may or may not have done the research themselves, but may be really attached to you coming to the same conclusion as they do. So I went through, for probably the second time in my life, the first time when I was first baptized, the second time in my life to just read through the book that is at the center of the Christian faith. And so I did that. And in the process of reading it now as a young adult, in a new environment and learning more about myself, I realized that I varied on some issues with my denomination, at least in terms of the emphasis on apocalypticism. And I turned out I was not a conservative. And so what do I do with that when I'm in a very clearly traditional religious community and context? I wasn't an antagonist. I'm really not an arguer or fighter. I just think things, and I enjoy thinking things. So I had to, as I was reading and connecting with other people who had thoughts, it helped me to find forums where I could speak freely and not kind of disrupt a Sabbath school class, for example, to talk with others who had thought those same questions and maybe learn from them which sources had been useful for them as they'd worked it out. All these kinds of creating an almost an alternate support system for myself outside of the conventional church structure, so that where I found the conventional church structure really resistant to questions, I found an alternate structure still within the Adventist community, but a system and group of people who were willing to ask questions and enjoyed really direct discussions. And so that was around 2006, 7, 8, thereabouts. Yeah, and that was a period that really energized my personal experience of faith, but also at the same time helped me to separate my spiritual identity from the church structure that I'd grown up. I think there's just a thing that everybody goes through eventually where you, what's the word? Individuate. So as a young adult in your home, you individuate yourself from your family. You kind of develop your own personality and way of looking at things, even if you still are connected to your family. And in the same way, I think it's just part of the process of spiritual development that you learn to recognize what your tradition offered you and where you vary from it, and how you can express that in your own context.
And I think, yeah, I agree with the individuation. I think it's very interesting. A number of the people that I've talked to as I've begun this project, oftentimes have to essentially disengage from the tradition that they came from. But you found a way to continue to dialogue within your Adventist community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I both I continued to participate for, like I said, about 5 of the 8 years that I was in West Texas. I stopped going about 2008 or 9, for maybe 2 years. And part of that was, at the time, the denomination was really, really struggling with how to deal with science. The tradition is it's a creationist religion, and that makes it hard for its scientists who recognize that there's more to the data than that conclusion. And as somebody who was in graduate education, it became pretty much infuriating that, some people thousands of miles away who aren't looking at the materials you're looking at would say, you're not entitled to draw this logical conclusion from the text that you've taken years to study. It didn't make any sense to me that should be how we go about dealing with information or knowledge. So that was one thing. Another thing was, at around the same period, the church was really struggling with its female ministers. And for the last 40 years, it's had multiple opportunities to make ordination a gender neutral designation. So everybody who goes to seminary, men and women, are entitled to go or allowed to go and take classes and graduate and become pastors and do the work of pastoring. And at some point in your career as a pastor, your community prays over you and recognizes that you've been called to do this vocation, but the denomination still to this day refuses to acknowledge the ordination of women pastors. And so that became an issue that surfaced around the mid 2000s, and is still, to our disgrace, a big issue today. And then a third issue that arose around that time was involved with the church's treatment of the LGBTQ community. I grew up in the UK during a time when nobody really talked about the LGBTQ people. And so I discovered very late that I was bisexual, and I discovered very late that there was a wider Adventist LGBTQ community out there in the misty ether. And so not until my mid-20s did I connect with this community or find a space in which I could integrate both faith and sexuality. And but I guess I still and have never really looked to the denomination to validate my understanding of myself. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are still growing up in this environment, and for whom whatever pronouncements are made from the senior levels of the church, they have a lot more weight than may be healthy for people who are just coming out or figuring out who they are and what their life options are. And so just observing from, I guess, a safe distance, psychologically, how my denomination was engaging the LGBTQ community both within and beyond the church, the way that we would kind of basically abandon our approach to religious liberty when it came to this issue, but wanted the support of other minorities when it came to protecting our Sabbatarian rights in the workplace. All these sorts of things just really woke me up, I suppose, and encouraged me to really just pay attention to the way that we wield religion as a weapon against people sometimes, instead of allowing it to motivate us to be more neighborly and more respectful of people who are different.
Mm-hmm. You're very active on Twitter, and we follow one another on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that places I first learned about you was actually there as part of the discussions around a number of hashtags related to LGBTQ relations within the church. I think the first one that I became aware of just through following them and finding your writing through that was, I believe, probably IKDG stories and Kiss Shame Bye, and then subsequently I learned about Q Faith and other related hashtag communities and discussion forums that happen publicly on Twitter. I am cisgender and I'm hetero, so I don't participate in those, but I observe them to try to become more familiar with the sorts of issues that LGBTQ people of faith kind of have to face and have to wrestle with, and the way they find the way they have begun to navigate. I know that. Please forgive me if I'm not phrasing this properly.
No problem.
Because this is definitely an area where I'm seeking just to listen and to learn from those who have the authority to speak, which I don't. I'm just here to listen and allow people to tell their stories. What have those sorts of communities and those sorts of discussions added to your own exploration of that part of your life?
So I joined Twitter around 2011, I believe, and my brother got me on to the site, and it didn't really take long for me to find other people who have a curious approach to religion and religions plural, not just their own or the ones that they grew up in, but are interested in learning more about religions in general and a responsible use of it in the public sphere. It didn't take long for me to find LGBTQ people in a number of traditions also. And Q Faith was, I think it started in 2013 or thereabouts. J. Mace III and D. Glenn started it so that it was, from the very beginning, a multi-faith project, a queer and trans-centric project. Idea behind it was to give people a space where LGBTQ people of faith, regardless of faith, could just come together and congregate. And also at the same time, it included a few people who, in the beginning, were not from any of those communities, but were still supportive and wanted to discuss. And so, I mean, that met on Sunday evenings for every Sunday evening around 6 o'clock. It still meets most Sundays. But for the first year and a half or two, there was a topical chat pretty much every week. And it was really vibrant. And some of the people that participated in it, I now consider friends. I think that's the beauty of a site like Twitter, where you're connecting with people not on the basis of familiarity like you do on Facebook, but there's a sort of a natural inclination to congregate around certain topics. And so you get to connect with people who are as engaged with as you are in learning about these things. and it kind of reduces social isolation for a lot of people who, especially if you're an introvert by temperament and or for whatever reason, whether you have physical disabilities or um, uh, like I do, an invisible disability where you might have energy issues or whatever else that limits your ability to go out and be stereotypically social. The internet and chats like this allow you to still connect with your community and grow and feel supported and be supported by other people. So I think that they serve a definite role in helping people to experience community in a non-traditional way. And so the I Kiss Shame Goodbye and other hashtags around engaging purity culture, those are much more recent, and I'm hopeful that they do continue. But they're giving people a space, regardless of sexuality, to re-engage the teachings that many of us were taught around purity culture, um, to do some growing, to explain how we've grown, um, and to kind of just stretch the boundaries of that conversation.
And did that purity culture extend over to the other side of the Atlantic, as it had such a it did have such a prominence in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s here? Was it similar over in the UK and in Jamaica?
Yeah, so again, because Adventism is pretty much a conservative tradition, so it did imbibe a lot of those messages around linking your moral value to your sexual practices, treating marriage as the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I'm being kind of flippant here because it's late
That's
and my filter is reducing.
That's okay.
But yeah, so I mean, like there was a lot of that sort of assumptions about what your life would look like as an adult. And if it didn't look like that, then people often did treat you with pity, at least. So just like many churches where the congregation is at least 60 to 70% female, and most of those are going to be heterosexual women looking for a man to partner with, but they aren't around. And then there are these disincentives for forming relationships with people who aren't part of your faith. So even if there were suitable partners for them, the church does not consider them suitable. So there's no support for you in building relationships that might actually give you the relationships that you're looking for. I didn't read I Kissed Dating Goodbye until I was in Jamaica, and a relative passed it on to me, and she was very excited about it, and I was not excited about it at all. But I did read it, and it didn't do anything for me. I don't say that that particular book is as the conversation should never devolve to a single book or a single person, because it's so much more complex than any of that. And almost in terms of focusing on a single book and a single person, you're there's that inclination to divert attention from those larger systemic questions around how we read the scriptures, how we interpret people's lived experience, who we consider viable witnesses about what they experience, how we engage desire, all those sorts of larger questions that affect everybody and not just a few. When we focus on a single person and a single book, as critical as they were for some communities, I think we're missing an opportunity to have those wider conversations. So I've tried my best not to be too hyper-focused, because I think I benefit more when I'm asking the deeper questions and engaging those. But at the same time, if folks are acting up, then we're going to notice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where some of those hashtags came from.
Yeah, yeah, and it's that the books by Joshua Harris. You're correct. It's only a couple of pieces of a much larger puzzle, and yeah, and by giving a single book that level of authority, it can be a double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah.
It provides it provides a good
Yeah.
starting place to begin a conversation about the larger culture of purity culture.
hmm hmm And at the same time, I don't want to underemphasize any of the actual experiences that people have had, because
Sure.
I've read plenty of stories since summer from people um, who whose childhood and youth was really shaped by their community's responses to that book and to the
Yeah.
ideas in that book, and the wider culture around it that discouraged dating and encouraged courtship, and all of
Mm-hmm.
the entailments that went along with that. Those are real stories
Oh,
and real
absolutely.
experiences, and I'm not in any way trying to be dismissive of that.
Oh, totally understood. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so on your site, you mentioned that you like to engage in talking about the three taboos,
Yeah.
which are politics, religion, and sexuality. We've gotten to a couple of those so far, um, but the one that kind of remains here is politics. And you have given a couple of recent talks, one of them being about atonement and nonviolence.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'd love to hear you speak to a little bit about that. It is certainly very timely as things like Twitter and other live streaming sorts of services has made the sorts of social injustices about systemic racism and other travesties and just horrific realities that people of color have to face within the overall society. Numerous accounts of police brutality. Again, being on Twitter and seeing and following a number of people that talk about these matters very frankly and very openly grieving, openly discussing the things that are affecting these communities. That's another thing that makes that a very powerful social tool. What do you see as a good response, either within through the lens of either your political or religious understanding to this sort of these large systemic social problems?
So the talk that I gave a few weeks ago on nonviolence and atonement was given to an Adventist audience. Um, that by and large was to the left of traditional atonement theology. Um, the headliner has a long-standing critique of substitutionary atonement theories and promoted the Christus Victor atonement model. So the substitutionary atonement for folks following along at home would be the one where uh, God kills Jesus in your place. And that's a very crude way of saying it, but that's basically how the models stack up. And in the Christus Victor model, rather than it being about God taking out his wrath on Jesus instead of taking it out on you, there's this kind of meta story around good and evil and the creative ways that God um, tries to subvert evil's expression through death or through violence. And so we spent like maybe 2.5 days trying to unpack what does that actually imply for the world that people actually live in. And so one of my challenges to the speaker and to people who consider themselves progressive Christians was, okay, so you consider yourself a proponent of nonviolence. That's awesome. What do you do with some of these images in our text that are very, very violent? And what do you do with the fact that the metaphors that we use are cognitive shapers? They're not just flat metaphors, they're not flat language, but they help to shape the way that we perceive and the way that we situate ourselves in relation to ourselves and in relation to the world around us and to other people. So when you have violent images in the text, whether that's in terms of genocide or it's in terms of the language that you use to describe women, or it's even in the vision where a whole bunch of people get wiped out to kind of resolve everything at the end of Revelation, these sorts of images have a corrosive effect on our ability to perceive suffering in the here and now and take responsibility for ending it. And so one of the examples that I raised was the fact that my church, the Adventist Church, formed in the mid 1800s during a time when there were so many U.S. government massacres of Native American people. And our church really said nothing about that. And it's striking to me that a church that is so committed to medical healing, for example, and education, and has a fundamental belief about the equality of human beings, would yet coexist with actual genocide, like literal actual genocide, and not say anything. And then that sort of passivity with regard to people suffering shows up again in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and in our time today, whether it's in terms of Rwanda, where church members were involved in the genocide there, or it's just in terms of here we are again, where Native American people are protesting, and validly so, against oil pipelines being built on their land without their consent and without consideration of their environmental impacts on their communities. And our church is not exercised about that. It's not energized about that. And so what is it about our vision of what it takes to make the world right? What it is about that vision that inures us to suffering that's happening in our time and makes us okay with things being bad for some other group of people, just in case, in tomorrow, the sweet by and by, we get it to be made right for the chosen few. Like, how can we be so willing to sacrifice the well-being of other people and still hold as good this vision of restoration and atonement? That doesn't really make sense to me. And so I just wanted to hold that challenge before the group and say, when we're talking about restoring all things and putting the world right, we have to make sense of the suffering of people and our responsibilities to those people. Because I think that it's a political question in the sense of we get to apportion our attention and we get to apportion our resources to resolve questions that matter. And if our doctrines don't encourage us to do that, but instead encourage us to stay focused on our own intra-community disputes and debates, and we never get mobilized to act on the world around us, I think there's something wrong with that. So I don't think I've ever been a kind of personal piety kind of believer. I don't see the point in that. And I think that there's a lot in the Adventist tradition and in Christianity more broadly that encourages a much more active participation in the world.
And speaking to those violent metaphors, where do you look for alternate metaphors, or which ones would you recommend are more appropriate to emphasize?
Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting that the Bible can be so ambivalent a source. So there are things that are just really monstrous about the text, and
yes,
and there are also things that I find quite beautiful about the text. So even in that same book, Revelation, where there's plagues and woman is both the Virgin Mother and the great whore of Babylon. At the same time, I'm really motivated by a vision of the new earth where there's not separation and there is provision for all people. And it bugs the heck out of me that it seems that John can't imagine getting there without a lake of fire. And he can't seem to imagine getting there without war and a conquering savior. And that's frustrating to me because I think it betrays a lack of imagination. And so I want to motivate people to imagine a world where we're not struggling for resources, because I think that it's possible. A world where we don't have this kind of intrahuman competition over power and authority. I don't think that's necessary. Thinking about a world where our words and our actions are healing and not destructive. those are the sorts of images that I find engaging around from the scriptures, from the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, some of the writings of Paul, not all of them certainly, but and some of the visions in Revelation. And I think this ability to recognize the ambivalence in those voices is just something that people of color have always had to do, and women have always had to do in relation to the text. So um, I'm not really breaking any new ground there in recognizing that there are some images that actually do seem to produce good fruit and other images that don't.
Can you unpack what you just said about women and people of color having to engage the text in a different way than white men, or
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something to that. I think, and certainly the people that have been in power, largely white
Mm-hmm.
men in Western civilization for hundreds of years,
Mm-hmm.
have always been selective. And I'm also speaking as I'm aware as a white man that I'm saying
Mm-hmm.
this. There's always been a selectiveness when it comes to what's being applied from
Mm-hmm.
from the biblical text.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the experience of women and people of color and how they have had to be selective as well in applying it to their lives and understanding the world?
Yeah, so where I'll start is with James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree. The Cross and the Lynching Tree is a really compact little book. The first section, Cone highlights the ways that traditional white theology kind of developed tunnel vision around the teachings of Jesus or the person of Jesus, but wasn't able to perceive Jesus in the lives of Black people in the Americas. And so he talks a little bit about um, some of the theological arguments that the white church tended to make as far as encouraging slavery or being passive around abolition. Um, he also quotes from Black preachers in the 1800s and 1900s, people who saw the social oppression and really had difficulty reconciling that with the message of Christianity. So he talks about that quite a bit in his book. Kelly Brown Douglas in Sexuality in the Black Church also engages some of the texts that have historically been used or weaponized against Black people and Black women in particular, and social theories around whether Black women are hypersexual or are eligible to be considered women even, and treated in the same way as white women. So she talks about that in her materials. And so womanist theology more broadly um, challenges the ways that Christian theology, both around atonement specifically and in general, has tended to lionize suffering. And that lionizing of suffering has meant that people going through social oppression aren't taught to value themselves such that they resist oppression, but they're taught to treat their oppression as imitation of Jesus, who suffered in silence and so on, all the way to the cross. And so there's this sense in which religion has been used to justify both people's mistreatment and to discourage their challenge of that mistreatment. So I'm kind of going in broad strokes there, but womanist theology has had this critique for a good 25 years plus. Same with that feminist theology and Black liberation theology. So those would be three sources. If somebody wanted to engage any of that, then those would be three sources that I would send them to.
Great. Thank you. In an effort to try to encapsulate the number of different threads that we've gone down through our discussion here, you mentioned in your challenge to the presenter at the conference you attended around atonement and nonviolence, that you wanted to kind of push back a little bit on the sorts of assumptions that some progressive Christians have.
Mm-hmm.
And you also have a history with and you come from a conservative denomination.
Mm-hmm.
But you have expressed that it is very good for Christians to be engaged in, for lack of a better term, the political sphere,
Mm-hmm.
putting their faith into action. What do you think would be the most appropriate way, or ways in which all members of different denominations might engage in these issues of more systemic problems or underlying social issues in a way that would be appropriate for the church to express that, not an apocalyptic vision, but a
Mm-hmm.
more hopeful and redemptive vision for the world and their place within it?
Mm-hmm. That's not an easy question to answer, for a number of reasons. I think that Christianity, and Christians, regardless of tradition, need to come to some sort of understanding of and peace with the fact that we live here on this planet, and by all biological measures, we were made for this planet. And so, in some ways, theologies that define us as alien to this planet and with our rightful home somewhere else in some other realm, are fundamentally unhelpful. So there's a strand of Christianity contemporarily that says, we are citizens of heaven and not citizens of wherever we happen to be citizens of. As somebody who is actually a dual citizen and living in a third country, I don't really care for that citizenship metaphor. Due respect to
Mm-hmm.
Paul, who came up with it. I think that it inures us to the idea that we actually are full participants and responsible for the development of human culture. And there's no passivity that is actually helpful when we say we belong somewhere else, because it means that we are both benefiting from and contributing to the morass of and the mix of positive and negative that is right here. So I think first figuring out that you are an earthling and you live here and you're responsible for what happens here, I think that's a fundamental piece to how do we then engage culture. Um, and then secondarily, I think that we it's worth distinguishing between what, say, congregations or denominations do as 501c3 organizations in the US, because there are appropriate strictures on what religious organizations can or can not do in relation to formal politics, or electoral politics, I should be specific. And then at the same time, I'm a real fan of Benjamin Barber's Strong Democracy. He writes a lot about ways that a strong democracy is one where people are invited to fully participate, that there's not like this autocratic center that just seeks people's compliance with opinions in order to minimize the range of ways that people can get involved. But in a strong democracy, there's like this intentional commitment to open and transparent communication, like the development of a common space where people engage the issues with as much information as possible, and can develop as many ways to participate as possible. So it's not just that we're talking about voting, it's not just that we're talking about local government, but that there are a myriad of ways for somebody to stay engaged with community life. And I think that it's important for Christians to be participants in community life if, as I say, we are of this world and we are born here and we are made for it, and therefore we have some responsibilities. So when I look at a local church, and I've been involved with a couple of them, not just within Adventism, but elsewhere as well, I'm I'm looking at a congregation to be a space where people can um, be encouraged to take their doctrines and ethics, their spiritual ethics, and apply them in the real world, whether that is through service to whatever the community might need, not from we have some kind of missionary authority over the unwashed masses, but in terms of, again, that sense that we're part of this community, so we have a responsibility to help nurture it, nourish it, and improve on it. So I'm looking for that kind of community responsibility and engagement opportunities to engage. I'm not so much looking for local congregations to be spaces where people are encouraged or discouraged from taking specific voting positions. I had the misfortune of sitting through a forum at an Adventist church in the Maryland metro, where they had the National Organization on Marriage and denominational religious liberty, family ministry, and theologians just really manipulating the space such that there was no right answer other than do not vote for civil same-sex marriage. And I really worried about the quality of conversation in not just in that congregation, which willingly hosted this forum, but in the denomination writ large, where how can you, it just did not feel like an appropriate use of religious authority to me, that so close to an election, they were willing to use their scholarly credibility this way, to bring in a non-Adventist to basically turn the electoral conversation into a referendum on whether Obama was black enough. All sorts of foolishness happened that day.
Oh, no.
So yeah, I'm not looking for that kind of engagement, because we've had enough of that through Christian dominionism over the last 20 years. We've really had enough of that.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think that just the sense that we are participants and responsible, I think could shift us in a different direction. Not that we're engaging so that we precipitate the end and can escape. I think that leads us to kind of almost this willingness to produce the apocalypse and kind of to be all too comfortable with that kind of brinkmanship.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm looking for the kind of responsibility that you have when you know you have to live with what you messed up.
Yeah. There's a famous essay by, I believe the author is Lynn White, called "The Roots of Our Ecological Crisis," and its thesis is essentially that during the Industrial Revolution, there were two things that happened that essentially precipitated the ecological crisis of the 20th century and beyond, which was that science and technology, which previously were separated, and there was some distance between them, joined essentially in a way joined forces, so to speak, and then also there was also the commerce and profit incentive that tied into that, and it also fed off of the fact that there was at the time a popular conception within Christianity that the world is essentially disposable. And those two factors led to some practices that we still haven't been able to shake 150 years later.
Right.
So, and one of my favorites, personally, there's a great N.T. Wright essay. Pardon me, N.T. Wright essay called "Jesus is Coming, Plant a Tree." So, so
I like that.
Yeah, it's very good, which essentially espouses that, and he does take an argument from a portion from Revelation where essentially the new heaven and new earth are created out of this earth, and that's what It's not ex nihilo, it's ex federe, out of the old.
Yes.
So that the work of redemption that was beginning, and looking back at another biblical text in Romans, that the creation is groaning, all those sorts of things, and that the new creation began with the resurrection of Jesus. All those different things can connect Christianity to a more hopeful vision of the future that is rooted in this world. And I think that's a very powerful sort of vision, and I appreciate what you said as well in relation to that.
Thank you. I like that thought. I'm going to look it up.
Yeah, it's that N.T. Wright essay was published there was at least for a short time, there was a copy of something called the Green Bible published instead
Yes.
of and it's took the NRSV version of the Bible, and instead of having red letters, it was green letters, and it basically colored within the text anything that could be applicable to a sort of stewardship or creation care. I don't know whether that term is still in vogue or not.
It is.
That was what my master's thesis was around,
Okay.
was creation care. But
okay, we should talk about that next time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do want to thank you very much for joining me this evening and talking across a wide array of topics. I appreciate you doing that. Where can people find you online? Where can they find your writing, and where they find you on Twitter or anything else you'd like to plug?
Yeah, so I am accessible on Twitter at McKenzian, MacKenzian. And that's just an easy way to pronounce my name, I should say. My surname doesn't have an A in it at all, but I did it that way so people found it easier to pronounce. And same with my website, McKenzian.com. One of the projects that I'm most proud of from the last year was mostly to do with the LGBTQ Christian conversation and the way that we talk with each other and about each other in the local congregational context. So there's a dialogue film that I'm a part of called Enough Room at the Table. And folks can watch that at enoughroommfilm.com. Pay what you're able to afford, minimum of 99 cents. And so that's one of the projects that I'm still willing to plug. But otherwise, come hit me up on Twitter.
Great. All right, Dr. McKenzie, thank you very much for joining me this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.